And what the research into workaholism shows is that that's not true, that long work hours do not lead to greater productivity. And if anything, it leads to burnout, or you get so tired that you make poor decisions. I got offered a job, as a fact checker at Vanity Fair, which is sort of a one way to get in, I suppose, but it was so awful. Work throughout human history has been really important for humans. It's how we earn our daily bread. It's how we survive, how we earn money, how we feed ourselves, or, find shelter. So, there's a survival function to it. But it's also, in its best sense, given us a sense of meaning and purpose. 1980, I went to Berlin in November of 1981. And I tell you, Checkpoint Charlie was scary. It was scary. There were, the Cold War was at its height, tensions were really high.
What if everything we believe about work is a lie? What if success isn't about grinding harder, but about working smarter? And what if the way we measure productivity is actually making us less productive? Today, we sit down with Brigid Schulte, a journalist who has spent years and years uncovering the hidden truth of our work and of our work culture. But how did she get there? What did she see in Japan that completely shifted her perspective on life and work? What was it about standing before the Berlin Wall in the 80s that made her question everything? Why did she, an incredible writer, have to start over and over in journalism, facing rejection after rejection? This experience shaped her vision of work, revealing the myth we've been sold and the systems that keep us trapped in overwork and burnout. But here's the real question: can we escape it? In this episode, we will explore her journey, challenge the toxic narratives around work, and uncover real solutions that are already reshaping the future. So, are we truly working for a better life, or is work running our lives? Stay tuned, you might just find the answers you've been looking for. Brigid is author of 2 books, Overwhelm and her latest, Overwork. Let's talk about 2 words she loves: human ecology.
Well, it's funny. I was trying to decide. I was part of a narrative writing team, and when they wanted us to kind of write up our beats, or like what is it that we covered, I was having the hardest time trying to decide, well, how should I describe what I do? And I was actually talking to a friend, and he said, well, you really write, because sort of what my editor asked me to do is just write about the way things are, write about how we live now. And so a friend of mine said, it's really like what you cover is human ecology, human beings and systems, and how we live as individuals and also as part of larger systems. And so I like that. So that's why I put human ecology down, that it was really about trying to understand kind of who we are and what we do and why, and how we interact with each other in our larger systems.
Her story begins in a rainy city, Portland, Oregon, but her roots stretch far beyond. Her mother's family were Irish immigrants, her grandfather earning US citizenship by fighting in the World War I. And on her father's side, there's a mix of German and Irish blood with a deep devotion to education. Her dad, a PhD and lifelong university professor, lived his work with passion. He didn't just clock in, he loved what he did. Brigid grew up watching him dive into his work with a purpose. And that's a lesson she wouldn't fully appreciate until years later. Her mother, a highly educated woman in medicine, had to put her career on pause when family responsibilities called, like so many women of that era. Yet, through her, Brigid learned that family isn't just the people in your home, it's the community that surrounds you. There were summits in Wyoming where her extended family weren't just vacation. They were lessons in connection, in belonging. So family, purpose, belonging, these early lessons will become the foundation of her work, shaping her journey to redefine how we think about time, work, and what truly matters. So, what were the defining moments of her childhood and adolescence, and the challenges that shape her, and the experiences that still spark a little bit of excitement when she looks back?
Moments of my childhood. Well, one of the things that I often talk about is growing up in Oregon, it's very rainy. It's very rainy, it's cloudy a lot. And so I became I think that, it sort of set me on a path to have more of an internal life, lots of time indoors. I spent a lot of time reading. I also learned how to play in the rain, because if you want to go outside, you're going to get wet. So I think two things. I really developed a love of reading and learning and stories, just because it was rainy. It was perfect to just sit inside and let your imagination go to so many places. I really, I think it instilled in me a real passion for learning, a real love of learning and language, and just how fascinating and big the world is, and how much there is to know and explore. And then I also just learned the value of, it's not that the weather's ever bad, you just need good clothes. And you can be outdoors at just about any time of year as long as you have good clothes. And so I grew up, I was an hour and a half from skiing on Mount Hood, going to the east, and I was an hour and a half from the ocean, kind of like a really moody, windswept, undeveloped coast in Oregon, and really developed a love for both the mountains and the sea.
Her first book is called Overwhelm. She explores the modern phenomenon of businesses and its impact on our lives. Through interviews and research, it offers insights and strategies to reclaim leisure, or leisure time more specifically, and live a more fulfilling life. She released it 6 years ago, before COVID.
Right. So my first book was really an accidental book, I have to say. I'd always wanted to write a book, and I always thought it would be a novel, and so I had all sorts of years of anxiety and, self-doubt and, feelings of inadequacy, and why was I not doing this? And I should be doing that, and kind of beating myself up a lot. And then on top of that, I had 2 small children. And so then I was beating myself up even more. It's why aren't you an amazing writer? And why aren't you a better parent? And why don't you have more time for this? And, and I was sleeping very little. And I just felt like such a failure, I was failing at my job, and, just really trying to hold on by my fingernails. And I felt like I was failing as a parent, I was a very guilty working mother. I felt like, because my mom was an at-home mom, and maybe I should be an at-home mom. And I loved spending time with my kids, but I also wanted to do my job, and I wanted to be a writer. It's why did it have to be either or? That's kind of what the choice felt like. Either you're a good parent, or you have you do a career well. It's and I kept saying, well, it's sort of the same question of that I had as a kid, where are the women? Why can't we be the heroes? Where are they in the story? It was sort of the same thing. Well, why is there this assumption that you can't? We have this lip service, you can do it all, but nobody felt like they could. And why was it so hard? And why did we expect women to make this either or choice where we didn't expect men to make that choice? And why couldn't we think about it as a both and? Why couldn't we have systems that would work for not just women, but anybody who wanted to have time for family or care? So that was really the first book, was out of my own personal experience. I just fell into that book. I was part of a team at the Washington Post, and we were looking at our readership numbers and seeing how young women were not reading the newspaper. And why people were worried about that is that women over 50 at the time were actually the most loyal newspaper readers. So if you did not develop a readership habit early on in women. They were worried that you would lose your market, in later years. So they wanted to figure out, well, how can we get young women, particularly in what they call this frenzied family era, how can we get them to read the newspaper? And I was appointed to this committee trying to look at, how are we going to get women to read the newspaper? And we all sat around the table at our first meeting and sort of like, well, duh, we know why women aren't reading the newspaper. They're really busy, And I was thinking about myself. It's like trying to get the kids out the door in the morning and trying to get myself out the door in the morning. It was like murder. And I was exhausted before I even got to the office, Uh, and so we figured, okay, well, let's find the data that show how busy women are. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. And talk about the one time you raise your hand and then your life ends up changing. So I did. I didn't know where to find this data, but I figured, Nielsen, they have data on like what people watch for TV. So certainly maybe somebody's got data on busyness or time, how people spend their time. So I just went to Google, busy women, mother time. And I found this entire field that I didn't know anything about at the time, people who study time use researchers. And there are sociologists and economists and psychologists who use this data to try to, again, understand how we work and how we live, and the choices that we make or that we feel that we can make, and how that impacts or could impact policy or workplace cultures. And so I ended up calling this one woman who, I think if she had been available, I wouldn't have ever written this book. She was a wonderful woman named Suzanne Dianchi, who was brilliant, but she was too busy to talk to me. So I couldn't talk to her about this question about why women weren't reading the newspapers. So the second name on the list was a guy named John Robinson at the University of Maryland. So I called him up and I said, we're doing this report on why women don't read the newspaper, and we figure it's because they're too busy. And he interrupted me and he said, you're wrong. Women aren't busy. Women have 30 hours of leisure a week. And I was like, you're out of your mind. I don't have 30 hours of leisure. And it's like, he's like, oh, it's not as much as men. Men have 40 hours of leisure a week, but it's, women have more leisure time, even though they work in the marketplace. And I was just like, well, I don't know. You're out of your mind, because I don't feel like I have 30 hours of leisure a week. And he said, yes, you do. Come and do a time study and I will show you where your leisure is. And so that was really, so I did the time study with him. I ended up writing about it for the Washington Post magazine, and it went viral at the time. And then agents started calling me and saying, do you want to write a book about this? And I was sort of like, not really, because I don't know what the answers are. And then I found a wonderful agent and a wonderful publisher who really got what I was trying to do. And they're like, you want to write a game changer. I said, if I'm going to do this, I want to understand deeply, why are things the way they are? And I want to understand, how can they be better? And not in a Pollyanna-ish kind of, take a bubble bath kind of way, but like, who's doing it better and where? And what could we learn? And so that became sort of the journey, if you will, of the book, of the first book, which is Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. And it really is a deep look at time pressure, gender, caregiving, and really how we undervalue leisure time, time to, not just take care of ourselves, but really enjoy life. And I will say that when I finished Overwhelmed, I was convinced that so much of what drove overwhelm, and particularly in the United States, and so much of what, makes us not value leisure, is our work culture. And we make it, and it's part of why it's so difficult to have a life of both and, meaningful work and life and family and care and, and leisure time. It's work that's out of whack. And so that's what spurred me to write the most recent book, is really trying to understand deeply, how do we think about work? How do we organize it? Why do we do it the way that we do? And is there a better way? And that's really what I went looking for. So both books are journey books, if you will, with a question in mind. And both of them at heart are really about, how can we ensure that all people across race and class and gender, all people have an opportunity to live a good, full, wholehearted life.
Una empresa cuya líder de talento humano es fuera de serie, muy probablemente es una empresa fuera de serie. En Hackers del Talento creemos en el potencial de talento humano, en buscar desarrollar esas personas fuera de serie que van a transformar sus organizaciones y América Latina. Cuando empezamos el podcast, muchas personas me escribieron preguntándome cómo ser un hacker del talento. Luego de analizar las entrevistas, identificar 35 características, profundizar sobre los retos y necesidades y futuro de las áreas del humano en América Latina, decidimos crear la Academia Hackers del Talento LATAM. Es un programa único de formación 100% online para aquella persona que quiere liderar el futuro del talento en nuestra región. Un programa donde los profesores son hackers del talento, CEOs y CHROs de compañías maravillosas con una gran experiencia. Un programa donde te conectarás con estudiantes maravillosos de todos los países de América Latina. Así que aplica ahora a la Academia Hackers del Talento LATAM. I have to admit, I haven't read Overwhelm yet. I started with Overwork. I promise I will read it later. And Overwork really made me reflect on something crucial: our connection to work. In many parts of the world, our identity is shaped by our job title, rather than who we truly are. We introduce ourselves by what we do, not who we are. Her new book explores how work has taken over our lives in ways we didn't even realize. So, Brigid, why do you think we have let work define so much of our worth, and how can we start to reclaim our identity beyond our jobs?
Yeah, this is one thing that I think is really important to understand. Like, I'm not part of the whole anti-work movement. There's a whole Reddit on anti-work. I'm really not. Work throughout human history has been really important for humans. It's how we earn our daily bread. It's how we survive, how we earn money, how we feed ourselves, or, find shelter. So, there's a survival function to it. But it's also, in its best sense, given us a sense of meaning and purpose, connection. It's part of how we connect or contribute to our communities. So good work is a really important part of life. And so that's sort of a key message that I think is important, is that what I'm talking about is good work. And I think what we've got in our modern era, and particularly in the United States, is kind of crappy work, to be perfectly honest. We've got knowledge work that, a lot of organizations expect a knowledge worker to overwork and overdo and give 150%. I mean, think about how many times we say that in one job, to be an ideal worker, to put work first. And so your health, your life, your family, anything that comes second. And at the same time, we expect we have low wage workers, hourly service workers, care workers that we pay very little, or we don't give them enough hours to work. So we're not creating jobs that are big enough for them to be able to, survive, do that kind of provide for their daily bread. So people are overworking on the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, cobbling together several different jobs, or jobs and side hustles and side gigs, jobs that don't offer health insurance, jobs that have unpredictable schedules. So there's increasing precarity, there's increasing demands all throughout the workforce, and it's really not working for anybody anymore.
Going back to her story, Brigid grew up escaping into books like Narnia, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, stories that transport her to other worlds. As she got older, her reading took a turn toward social justice and work, with Slaughterhouse-Five and Catch-22 leaving a deep impact. But it was Ursula Le Guin who truly changed everything. She didn't just tell stories, she rewrote the rules, providing that heroes didn't have to fit the usual mold. They could be women, people of color, or even characters without a defined gender. Le Guin once wrote, "We read books to find out who we are. What other people, real or imaginary, do and think and feel is an essential guide to our understanding of what we ourselves are and may become. For Brigid, that was exactly it. Stories weren't just entertainment, they were a way to see what was possible. Brigid, tell us please, how did this book shape your perspective on storytelling and the kind of narrative you wanted to bring to life?
Oh, yeah, that's very true. And sometimes people ask about change and transformation, since that's a lot of what I report and write about. And I often say sometimes the longest and sometimes even the hardest journey is just between your own ears, that shifting your mind and the way you think about things is sometimes the most powerful thing you can do, and can lead to enormous transformation.
So, what led you to study journalism? Was there a key moment in your life? Or maybe deep down you want to become like Oriana Fallaci, a fearless, relentless woman, always asking the hardest questions? Because as Fallaci once said, journalism is an extraordinary and terrible privilege. It means forcing yourself to understand, to explain what you've understood, and above all, to see what others don't want you to see. What drew Brigid in? The need to uncover, to challenge, to tell stories that matter?
Yeah, how did I get there? Well, so honestly, when I was in college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I did love reading and writing, but I didn't kind of know where I fit. And I did write some short stories and they were terrible. So I was really worried that I was a terrible writer, or terrible with fiction. Um, but I got an English degree, again, because that's what I knew and loved. I also ended up getting degrees in languages because I love languages. I studied German and French at the time. I've since learned some Spanish, which I've forgotten. I lived in Japan and I've learned it and forgotten it. But I love languages. I love how you can learn, a different way of thinking just by the words and language and phrases that just can tell you so much about culture and people. And then I also studied, they didn't have a journalism degree, so I studied what's considered communications at the time. And I ended up reading, at the time they were called the new journalists or narrative journalists. And what I loved about them is that they combined the things in fiction that make a story so compelling, a beginning, a middle, an end, using details, setting scenes, using dialogue, writing in such a way that there's a cliff and then you want to know what happens next. And then you start it and then, or you go deep into the history and, really using a lot of powerful writing techniques, but then applying it to real world situations and going deep with the reporting. So it wasn't just sort of a drive-by quick interview, but really spending time with people and watching their lives unfold, kind of an immersive kind of reporting. And so it's like when I found out, kind of like when I discovered that kind of writing, I felt like, this feels like what I can do. This feels right. And so I really became drawn to kind of narrative nonfiction, if you will. Really sought it out, continued to read it, continued to seek it out. And so then, again, not knowing what to do with myself, I didn't know how to get a job. And my dad was like, he wanted me to be an engineer or a nun or, something like that. Something very practical. And my mom just wanted me to get married. It's like, oh, your degree is just in case you don't find somebody. So very weird mixed messages, like education was important, yet, it wasn't important enough for me in terms of my own identity. It was more like, now you can attract, an educated, spouse. Yeah, honestly. So in a way, like, I suppose another very powerful influence, growing up is, again, not feeling like my parents, the church, or my culture saw me as a full human being, that I was a girl, I was a woman. You read some of the theology that I went to Catholic school. So, you read Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine, and women are sort of considered half-formed men, and that always just felt so enraging to me. It's like, what? Why am I not a full person on my own right? And I think that that's, to be perfectly honest, that's been another huge driver in my life is, why can't we have systems that recognize the fullness of everyone's humanity, regardless of who you are? Why does a man, a cisgender, usually white man, why does that have to be the default and everything else is sort of not as important? We talk about the sort of the single story. Well, that's the single story throughout human history. And I'd like to be part of opening that up to multiple stories, the whole tapestry of heroes and stories and ideas. And so I think that's been another very powerful influence on me. But in terms of how I got to be a journalist, so I graduated with this degree and I didn't really quite know what to do with myself. And I had spent some time living in Europe and, I had a year abroad in Austria learning German. And it was such a powerful year of independence, of travel, of learning other cultures, that I had an opportunity to go to Japan and live and work there as a teacher for a couple of years.
I want you to talk about the future of work. Not just where we are headed, but where we should be going. As Hannah Arendt was said, the human condition is not labor, but action. And as Buckminster Fuller put it simply, we are called to be architects of the future, not its victims. So in her vision, what does a better future of work look like? And how do we move beyond burnout and overwork to create something truly meaningful?
Oh, that's easy. Yeah, that's easy. And in every single chapter of my book, I end with a story that shows how it can be better right now. And at the end of the book, I have an appendix where here's 10 things that you can do as a person individually. Here's 10 things you can do as an organizational leader. Here's 10 things that you can do if you're a policymaker or things that we should be thinking about sort of in a larger societal sense. There's a lot of good stories out there. And I feel like they're not getting enough attention. And so that's part of the goal of my book and the writing that I'm doing is showing that there is a different way and it's not scary and it's not weird and it's actually happening. So when I think about a healthy or a better future of work, I think of work, I go back into history. One of the books that I read that was very influential as I was writing this book is by a Dutch historian named Jan Lucassen, and he wrote about the story of work. And he said throughout human history, good work has been defined by 3 principles: meaning, fairness, and cooperation. So I think that all you have to do, like a good future of work would have those 3 elements. And you'd have to ask yourself, is this, is this creating and providing meaning? Is this fair? And am I doing it in cooperation with other people, within the organization, within the community? We often talk about the Protestant work ethic, and that drives so much of Western work norms. And that's sort of work till you drop, work till you die, and then your reward will come in heaven. That's literally what the Protestant work ethic is. It's very exploitive. And it was really, it benefited the people at the top because you could pay your workers very little, work them like maniacs, and then just say, well, God will give you your reward while you went laughing to the bank as the CEO. And so people have to understand that that's the foundation of a lot of Western work culture. But there's a wonderful book by a philosopher named Elizabeth Anderson that she wrote in this past year. And she talks about how there was actually another Protestant work ethic at the same time that kind of came up at the same time that was much more pro-worker, much more progressive. And it was all about how there was sort of an equality of callings, that all work was important and that all work should be good work. And that meant paid work as well as unpaid work. So care work, taking care of the home, volunteering in your community, being involved in your, the civic life and the democracy or whatever. All of that was valuable. They were all callings. And that every piece needed to work together like a big clock. And the whole goal of good work was bettering the common good for everybody, bettering everybody's well-being, bettering everybody's quality of life, versus in kind of what we ended up with, this more conservative, exploitive Protestant work ethic. It's led to just really grotesque inequality, where there are very few people, the haves, with an awful lot, and everybody else with very little. And just creating, that's really destabilizing. We'll see how long it lasts. But so when I think about a future of work, I think of shared prosperity. I think of some of the reporting that I did in some of the countries like Scotland or Iceland, where they're actually looking at redefining work and redefining their economy so that it's not just about growth and GDP, but it's about human well-being, and using measures like child poverty or loneliness or, social connection. How many parks do you have access to? Like quality of life measures, which when those become the center of your policy, when those become the center of your organization, that you want human well-being, that when you prioritize that and you're clear about what your work is, what the priorities are, what people's jobs are, their responsibilities. And then there's an element of accountability. You also have to make sure that people are doing that work. And if they don't fit, then there's time for them to find something else. But, really understanding that you're only as good as your people. And that's even as we're talking about AI and technology, because there are things that human beings and the creativity and the ideas and the innovation that we have that AI can certainly augment and help, but can never replace, or the care and the connection that human beings have. So I think the organizations that recognize that and really put people at the center of their decision making and think about those three principles of meaning, fairness, and cooperation. To me,
3 hacks for a better future of work. First, ditch the burnout mentality. Work shouldn't be about endless green. Fairness, cooperation, and meaning matter probably more than productivity. Second, success beyond profits. Countries are redefining progress with well-being metrics. Why not companies too? Third, security fuels innovation. While people aren't stuck in jobs out of fear, creativity and collaboration thrive. So the best workplaces put people first. Now let's go back to Brigid. We often hear that work pays off, but at what cost? Studies, listen to this, studies show that workplace stress is now a major contributor to chronic diseases, heart issues, anxiety, even a shorter lifespan. In Latin America, where long hours and job insecurity are common, many feel trapped in a system that values output over well-being. From your research, how do you see the link between work and health? And more importantly, what can we do to break this cycle?
Yeah, I've got a whole chapter on that in the new book. It was something that I was very, very surprised by as well. There's been a lot of really great research on the connection between work, stress, and health. It's been happening for several decades. It's just finally beginning to get some attention. But what's been really, it's been really powerful to see that, when we talk about burnout or we talk about people getting sick at work, we tend to think, well, it's just an individual. They weren't able to handle something, or, they need to do something better, or they need to do something differently, or, you should take a stress reducing class or whatever. So we tend to look at it as if there are individual problems that require individual solutions. And I think what this research points out that's so powerful is that it's certainly, there's always an element of individual responsibility, and, mindset is very important. But that a lot of what drives burnout and what drives ill health at work is really our work systems. When we have the work demands are too high and the rewards don't match the effort that we're giving. They talk about the effort and reward mismatch. If you have a toxic boss, if you feel like you're not working in a place where it's not fair, where there's sort of a lack of a sense of justice, all of that, they call them psychosocial stressors. It's sort of like what all of us go through every single day, that can build up. You can lead to an acute illness, like a heart attack, or a stroke or something that happens in the moment, or it can build up over time and lead to chronic illness. So when you think about it, your, long work hours, that's something that's also related to poor health and high stress. So if you work long work hours over long periods of time, you're much more likely to have cardiovascular disease or diabetes. People who don't take vacation are much more likely to have depression or again, have cardiovascular issues. Human beings are not machines. We work best when we have off periods, when we get to turn off and power down and we rest. So that is really, really important research. There's research that I cite in the book by Jeff Pfeffer and some of his colleagues where they had done a meta-analysis of more than 200 of these work, stress, and health studies and found that simply those 10 psychosocial stressors have actually made work the 5th leading cause of death in the United States.
How much does it cost?
Yeah, right. Those are really huge costs. And the irony is, and I know I addressed this in the chapter on workaholism, all of that overwork, we tend to think, well, it's just what we need to do to be productive. It's just what America needs to do, or what other organizations need to do to just, work and pound it out. And what the research into workaholism shows is that that's not true. That long work hours do not lead to greater productivity. And if anything, it leads to burnout, or you get so tired that you make poor decisions. Your thinking becomes fuzzy. You make mistakes. So longer work hours and working, overworking actually leads to poorer work. And so organizational leaders should want to try to mitigate against that and make sure that people are not overworking, because it's going to cost you more in the long run.
Going back to her story, do you remember that Brigid refused to accept a world where women were seen as half men? Thank you, Brigid. She challenged the expectations placed on her and chose to tell the stories that needed to be heard. And I want to mention 3 hacks. First, question the default. Who benefits from the way things are? Second, if the system doesn't see you, rewrite the narrative. And third, facts inform, but stories transform. Brigid had already explored different cultures, but Japan was a whole new world, one that would challenge her perceptions and reshape her understanding of work, community, and identity. In a society that is built on discipline and tradition, yet rich in nuance and depth, how did she navigate it? What did she learn? Because, as Shusaku Endo once wrote, true strength lies not in never failing, but in understanding the weaknesses of others. Did Japan teach her this in unexpected ways? What memories stay with her from that time?
Yeah, well, and that's also, it's part of the story. It's part of how I got where I am. I didn't really know anything about Japan, and I was just ready for an adventure, I guess. I had gone to like I mentioned, my dad taught at the University of Portland, and so now as a parent I can understand, but as a kid I was really resentful that I had to go there. Now I understand it's called tuition remission. So my dad didn't have to pay any tuition if I went there, and he had 4 daughters. So I get it. But at the time I really wanted to go somewhere else. You're young, you want to explore, you want to be on your own. And so after 4 years, I was really ready to just go. So I graduated on a Sunday, and I left Monday morning at 8:00 in the morning to go fly to Japan. And I didn't come home for 2.5 years. And it was just a fascinating experience. Talk about really, sometimes it was very, very lonely. But I traveled a lot. I learned a lot. very, very eye-opening just to be in a completely, really different culture. It was very difficult for me to learn the language, whereas other languages I'd been able to pick up very quickly. So it was very humbling. But I joined an Aikido dojo, and some of the teachers became my best friends, and I would go out for shochu and dinner afterwards, and, it was just a really very, very, very enriching time. It's a fascinating culture. I'm still I just sent my Christmas cards. I keep in touch with some of my students, they weren't that much younger than me. They're really more my friends, I went back, when I was working on my most recent book. And it was fascinating to go back all these years later. And then I took my daughter and we went back to the school where I taught, and she met some of my students. We got to see my old dorm room where I used to live. And, that was wonderful. And I had a translator, who has since become a really good friend. And it was just so wonderful to have, because I never got very good at Japanese, I have to say. I could carry on very rudimentary conversations, and my students were okay in English, but there was something so wonderful about having a translator there where you could really get deep, and really understand what people were really thinking, what they were really feeling. And they were so much more complex, and their lives were so much more complicated than I ever knew at the time. So talk about another, was this 30 years later, how humbling it was, kind of like my own ignorance at the time. It just really showed me the power of taking time and listening and really connecting and caring about what people's stories are, in the moment. So, I could go on and on about Japan, but I traveled all throughout, Southeast Asia, and went to Tibet when it first opened up, spent a lot of time in China, we spent time in Thailand, and it was just really, one of, just an amazing experience in my life.
In the early 80s, Brigid found herself in Berlin, a city split in two, where history pressed against the present with an almost suffocating weight. It was the height of the Cold War, and crossing into East Berlin through the checkpoint Charlie wasn't just a change in geography. It was stepping into a different reality. Silence, suspicion, a world where walls didn't just divide streets, but also lives, opportunities, and future. What was it like to witness the contrast, to feel the tension of a divided world? Because as she walked those streets, did she already sense that one day the wall will fall? Or did it seem as permanent as the concrete it was built from?
Yeah, it was the 1980s. I'm dating myself, but yeah, I was there in 1981, 1980. Yeah, I went to Berlin in November of 1981. And I tell you, Checkpoint Charlie was scary. It was scary. There were, the Cold War was at its height, tensions were really high. I remember going over into East Berlin, and, it was silent. We were clearly American. We stood out. There was just, people would look suspiciously at you. It was really uncomfortable being there. And then you'd go back to West Berlin, and it's just like the nightlife was, going all night long, and, just so much life on the streets. And I tell you, I went back to Berlin. I was giving a talk in, I think it was like 2016, something like that. And I took my son with me, because that's one of the things I love to do when I have an opportunity to travel, is bring my family with me, or bring my kids with me, and show them the world, kind of open doors for them if I can. And we had such an amazing time, to go see how changed it is. It's like, to me, all of the things that Berlin has gone through, from, the Second World War and Nazi Germany, and then transforming that, and then the Cold War and the East and West tensions, and how that's been transformed. And, granted, there's still a long way to go. There's a lot of difficulties, like there is human life, we're imperfect. There will always be challenges. But to me, it was such a testament in the power of transformation to see that city, 30 some years after being there as a college student. And Checkpoint Charlie is now like a tourist attraction, and everybody's laughing and joking. And we actually stayed in East Berlin, kind of the old East Berlin, and rode our bikes everywhere. And there's like these little bricks in the street to show you where the old wall was. And you can just ride all around, and that's gone, and that there's so much freedom of movement, and there's so much hope. My son loved it so much that he actually went back there and studied. And then after he graduated, he actually graduated with a minor in German because that trip was so powerful for him. And then after he graduated from college, he went and lived there, and worked for a couple of years in Berlin. He loved it. He probably will go back at some point. So it's a really, it was an amazing experience.
Brigid's path to the Washington Post was anything but linear. She left Vanity Fair to return to Wyoming, drawn by family and the spirit of the West. There, she defied tradition by joining her uncles on a cattle drive, an experience that later became even a magazine story. Her first newspaper job was at Casper Star-Tribune. It ended in failure. Her editor hated the kind of writing she excelled at, and she was let go. It was a harsh blow for a lifelong overachiever. A former colleague then urged her to take a chance in South Carolina, where she worked at a small paper, doing everything from reporting to photography. That experience shaped her, teaching her the power of storytelling and the responsibility of journalism. It also set her on a new path, one that led her to Washington, D.C., covering the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, and eventually becoming a Washington correspondent. What defining moments shaped her along the way?
I did a lot. I learned a lot that way. And then from there, I ended up coming to the Post. And I would say that's really where that was where I was able to develop more kind of the narrative writing style that I'd really been drawn to initially. And I wrote a lot for different sections of the paper, for the magazine. They used to have this wonderful section called Outlook that would combine sort of the personal storytelling with kind of political and policy elements, or, where you could be very personal, but put yourself in a larger universe and see how your story fit into a larger perspective. So that was really great. So that I started at the Post when my son was, a baby. He was like 8 months old, and I left when he was 6'4". So I spent quite a bit of time at the Post, about 17 years.
The reality is we glorify workaholism. We reward those who burn out for the job. Higher salaries, bigger bonuses, more recognition, filling a cycle that's really hard to break. It's a vicious loop. The more they overwork, the more they're valued, reinforcing a culture where exhaustion is a badge of honor rather than a warning sign.
Yeah, it's like, but you're right, and we've got it backwards, because what we're rewarding, it's like we're using an outdated way of measuring good work. So we're using time and presence like we would in a factory to judge good work that's done, like kind of creative work or knowledge work. And what we really should be doing is thinking about measuring impact, measuring performance, measuring output, rather than the input of sitting at a desk or punching in. So it's time for us to think about new metrics, because if you do, then you automatically, it doesn't really matter how, when you work, where you work, or how long you work. If you are performing, if you are meeting your performance goals, if you are meeting your deadlines, with high quality work, and the communication is clear and the expectations are clear. I mean, all of those things need to be in place. But when you have those output focused systems and clear priorities and, accountability and communication, then you can have so much more flexibility that then enables workers of color, workers with care responsibilities, workers who are not sort of the traditional ideal worker with no life. You enable them to really be able to have a both and kind of life. You enable them to do meaningful, good work. You enable that, if you reward the output rather than just solely just being there and present, the research shows that you then reward a much more diverse group of people, a diverse group of workers, and it leads to more equity, and more equity leads to more equity, and so it's a virtuous upward cycle.
Yes, we face an incredible challenge, reshaping entire work cultures. But let me tell you something. Change starts with us. As leaders, as teams, as individuals, we have the power to challenge outdated norms and build workplaces where well-being matters as much as results. The question is, what role will you play in driving that change?
Yeah, because it's a story. It's a story we tell ourselves. The first one in, last one leaves. They must be the best worker. But oftentimes what that leads is to just busyness. You're not even really doing important or good work. I mean, I've seen it my whole life. You have a boss that values presence. Well, then people are going to be there late at night. And I never forget this one story. There was an editor that's what they believed. The best workers were, always work really late every night. And so a friend of mine was an editor, and he was there. Again, it was really late one night. And so the top editor came out. It's like, I could tell all the best people because they're still here. It was 11 o'clock at night. And my friend turned around and looked at all the screens, that the top editor couldn't see. And half the people were playing solitaire. So they weren't working. They were pretending to work. They were looking like they were working to try to meet the story, the narrative that the top editor had as what a good worker is. And so what they were doing was not good work, but they were also, I don't want to say gifting their time back to the company, but they were robbing themselves of time for their lives. They were robbing their families of time for connection. And that's just such a tragedy, such a waste. When you think about it, we're here for a limited time only. Our lives are fairly short, what is it, 4,000 weeks or something like that. We don't have the time to waste like that. And organizational leaders shouldn't want that either. Because then, honestly, we did this one research project. I was sort of the storytelling partner that I worked with Ideas 42, a behavioral sciences firm. And we wanted to try to understand what drove overwork. And, what would there be some behavioral science sort of interventions that we could design to help people. And it was amazing. In all of these interviews, almost everybody just said, I'm busy all day. I'm answering emails and Slacks, and I'm going to meetings, and I'm just flying all day long. My inbox is always full. And then at the end of the day, I haven't gotten to that one big thing I really needed to. And so then they worked in the evenings, or they would stay late, or they would take work home on the weekends. And then they would get tired and burned out and exhausted and angry and resentful. That's not the workforce that you want. And when you looked at what they actually did during the day, a lot of that was just busy work that they did. It wasn't important work. And so that was sort of one of the interventions that we tried. It's like, and I have to say, I think to me, one of the most powerful things that I learned in reporting this book is when I spent time looking at companies who had done some really successful work redesign experiments and COVID experiments and short work hours experiments. And everybody did it differently. So there's no one size fits all. It really depends on your team and your organization and your business and your value and all of that. But there is a process that they all followed that I found so powerful that anybody can do at any level. You can do it for yourself personally. You can do it as a team leader or an organizational leader, at whatever level. And it was really taking a step back, kind of taking a deep breath and saying, what is our work? What are we really doing? What is the most value? How do we create value? And you would be surprised how many people don't do that, or they don't know. And then you figure out what are your processes that lead to that good work. you know, it's amazing how many people say, well, we do it because we've always done it this way. There's sort of like this status quo bias. And so what I began to think about is work in three ways. There's sort of the center of the circle. There's the work that's really valuable, that gives you a sense of meaning and purpose, that creates value for your organization, that does good in the world. And then there's the work around the work. Emails, meetings, logistics, sort of like a merry-go-round. And that's often where we get stuck. Round and round and round we go. But it doesn't ever lead to that. It should lead to that better work or that meaningful work, but it often doesn't. And then the other circle that I think about, I call it the work around the work, or some people call it the performance of work, or the performative busyness. And that's when you're in these work cultures, and that's what they value is presence and input and hours. And you're trying to be an ideal worker. You will create that busyness to look busy. You will show up to meetings you don't really need to be at because you want to show that you're here. You'll send late at night emails whether you'll need to or not because you're performing work, because that is what we value and that is what will be rewarded. And so what I would really like to do, the research is so clear that, all that's going to do is enable people who are already, like the people in power, that's how they got there. That's just going to enable more people like them to rise and be in power. And who is that? It's largely men with no caregiving responsibilities. So you're just replicating corporate monoculture over and over and over again. And you are shutting out women, people with care responsibilities, workers of color. And that's what I want to turn on its head. Because if you focus on the performance rather than the input, that's when you create opportunity.
I was fascinated by the appendix of her book. It's like a blueprint for a better future of work. One concept that really caught my attention was low job control. It's something so many people experience, yet rarely name. So Brigid, can you break it down for us? What is exactly, and more importantly, how do we fix it?
Right. So when you feel like you have low job control, you feel like you have very little power or say over your workload or your day, your schedule, your time. And that creates a lot of stress. So what are some things to do about it? Go through your own sort of performance, it's sort of like an excellence mission, if you will, and think yourself, what is your work? What is the value that you create? What gives you a sense of joy and challenge? What adds value to the organization that you're part of? And then how can you back it up and create the processes that will make sure that you prioritize that? And then, experiment with it. Try it, practice it. But this is what's important, because if you're trying to do this on your own and it's not part of a larger organizational movement, you need to be able to communicate that really clearly up the line, to get buy-in from your manager, from your boss, and then see if you can make ripples outward. At the same time, talk to your peers, see if they can do something similar. See if you can find peer networks and peer supports so that you can all work together to try to make the job quality and the conditions of the job better for everybody.
2 hacks from Brigid Schulte, author of Overwork.
Oh, the best advice. That's a tough one. There's, I guess what I would say is I would just keep it really simple, and I would just say, rest. Have compassion for yourself. Listen, I struggle with overwork myself. We're all products of the environment that we live in. So I would say be compassionate with yourself, and if you find yourself overworking, stop, give yourself a rest, and, notice it. And, tomorrow's another day. Pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and try again. Start again.
To wrap up this powerful conversation, let's highlight 3 game-changing hacks from Brigid Schulte that every hacker del Talento can apply starting now. First, let's redesign work. We've been measuring success by hours worked instead of real impact. Brigid reminds us that the future of work must be built on meaning, fairness, and collaboration. It's not about how long you sit at a desk, it's about the value you create and how you balance life beyond work. Second, break free from the burnout culture. Working longer hours doesn't make us more productive. It makes us sick. Burnout isn't an individual failure, it's a systemic flaw in how we structure work. Leaders, you're hearing us, must stop rewarding overwork and start valuing efficiency, creativity, and well-being. And finally, the third hack, humanize work. The link between work stress and chronic illness is undeniable. We're not machines. We need to rest. We need purpose. We need connection. Imagine if companies prioritize quality of life as much as profits. Countries like Iceland and Scotland are already there, redefining economic success through well-being. So it's time for organizations to follow. Let me remind you that the future of work is ours to shape. Listen to Hackers del Talento y espero verte en la academia aprendiendo cómo liderar desde talento humano y convertirte en un CHRO fuera de serie. Hasta un siguiente episodio.